It's time to take a look at the waiver wire and look at 10 wide receivers that you could pick up for week 13. We're getting deep into the season now. We're about to hit the fantasy playoffs. The waiver wire isn't too grandiose, but it has been pretty down all season. We got a lot of the same names to look at, but we still need to talk about them just in case you need to make some pickups. And week 13 is hitting heavy on the bye weeks and injuries. So you're going to need that waiver wire this week. But what you need to do right now is click that subscribe button. Tap it with the finger on your phone. Click it with the mouse on your computer. Whatever you need to do to get the job done. We go heavy on the advanced metrics here to help you with your research. We do that every day. It's going to help you for your drafts in August. So clicking that button will allow you to find this resource sooner. And then also, we're going to help you set that waiver wire. We're going to help you find those gems like we do every week. And we also help you set those lineups and win those trades. But click that button. Stop missing out. Let's look at these 10 players here, these 10 wide receivers that you can get off waivers. Starting with Jaden Reed. And the thing about these Packers wide receivers, I expect him, Doubs, Christian Watson to all be rostered in the majority of leagues by now because they're hitting off and on. They're getting somewhat consistent. Christian Watson's been up and down, but had a big game last week. The nature of this offense is one hits, one's kind of mid, and then one kind of hits the floor and might be all right to mid. The thing about this is you can't predict which one's going to go off. Jaden Reed has been consistent as of late. 19 fantasy points in week 10, 19 in week 11, 15 in week 12. He's consistent. He's got draft capital, broke out with 2 different collegiate programs at Western Michigan and at Michigan State. Very nuanced, cerebral route runner. Plays in the slot a lot and also gets a deep A-dot, which is a good thing to see with a player who's used in the slot a lot. He can also be used on the outside. He's very dynamic. Last 4 games, seeing almost a 17% target share. Running a fair amount of routes, but averaging 15.2 PPR fantasy points per game. So he's getting workload, he's getting opportunity, and he's very efficient when he's on the field. And he's on waivers. You might as well pick him up and see what happens because there's nothing much else on the waiver wire. As you can see, as we work our way down through this list. Next is Demario Douglas, who has been productive since Kendrick Bourne has been out and has been seeing an increase in opportunity. Last 3 games, 8.3 targets per game and a 24% target share. Like we say every week, if there's a wide receiver saying a 20% target share or more, you need to pick him up, play the matchups with, have him on the back end of your roster at least, see what can happen with him. With Demario Douglas, his A-dot is very low. He gets a lot of short targets, which impacts his upside, impacts his ability to really be a home run threat in fantasy football. But if you need him in a pinch and he's on your roster, you can use him to get you by. He's getting enough targets where he's fairly consistent. And looking at his scoring output, week 7, 11 fantasy points. Week 8, 8. Week 9, 10. Week 10, 14. Week 11, bye. Week 12, 10.9. So good enough to get you by, good enough to be okay, but not good enough to be over the moon. So if you need to be over the moon, you may have to look the other way. But a wide receiver pushing a 25% target share should not be on waivers at all. And if you have them on your roster, you can play with them in your lineups, play the guessing game of who to start. He's going to be a hard guy some weeks to put in your lineup because you know the upside's really not going to be there, but he's consistent. He's reliable. With bye weeks like this, he's a guy that could get you through because he's reliable. He's going to get you around 10 fantasy points. And if he doesn't hit, it might be like a 7 spot or something like that. But still, the target share is there. Looking at Curtis Samuel, he's a guy that we've been picking up off and on throughout the season. 6.7 targets a game in his last 3, 15.6% target share, 7.7 PPR points per game in those 3 contests. The thing about this and Curtis Samuel, the Washington offense, go look at the game logs here and go look at the wide receivers, tight ends, the pass catchers, and each game you'll see a game log of the passing stats that is this long. And the reason for that is Sam Howell just slings the rock to everybody. He doesn't care. Terry McLaurin is the consistent option in this offense. This has caused Curtis Samuel to be a little bit spotty. This has caused Jahan Dotson to be a little bit spotty. But still, Sam Howell's a good quarterback, and good quarterbacks do that. He's a very good quarterback for what the Commanders paid for. Curtis Samuel, if you need an upside play who's getting consistent workload, then he's a guy to look at. He's a guy that could be a hot piece off the waiver wire from time to time, and you're going to have to pick your spots, play the matchups, but that's what you're doing waiver wire wide receivers here in Week 13. Noah Brown, we're watching the injury status here. The thing about this is we want Texans wide receivers. That's it. We want Texans wide receivers because C.J. Stroud's that good. Even with him being like the third option there with Nico Collins and Tank Dell, we still want Texans wide receivers. He was going off in weeks 9 and 10. There was injuries in the offense. Nico Collins was out one. Robert Woods was banged up a little bit. We've had some injuries that allowed him to propel himself, but he's also proved himself. He looked good. He's been consistent a little bit. He's been getting a lot of workload. And anybody running routes in this offense, getting targets that has a pulse, you can have on the back end of your roster to see what happens, especially when you got bye weeks. But again, injury status, that's the most important thing when we're looking at Noah Brown. If he's looking good, you want him on the back end of your roster because he's a Texan, and that's the bottom line. Now we're looking at Kahlil Shakur. Snaps are increasing. He has been productive up and down because he's a big-time lottery ticket, air yards wide receiver. So the thing about him is how you play him, how you strategize around him. So rewinding back to Demario Douglas, who was averaging 11.9 PPR points per game in his last 3 contests, and now looking at Kahlil Shakur, who in his last 4 contests have given you 9.7, 3.4, 7.7, and a 20.5 pointer. If you need upside and you're looking at waiver wire wide receivers, let's say you had a Thursday matchup and one of your guys busted, or maybe 2 guys busted, and you can't really afford to play it safe, and you want to swing for the home run fence, and you're looking at a wide receiver like this, not just Shakur, but another type of wide receiver like this who gets air yards, who's a deep threat, but is very up and down. The thing about him is you can plug him in your lineup, close your eyes, hope for the best, and maybe that 1 out of 5 game happens, and you get 20 fantasy points, 30 fantasy points, whatever happens. Or you get 9, 7, 3, 5. Think about 5 versus that 11-point something spot that Demario Douglas is getting you on average. That's only a 6-point variance. So if you strike out on a player like this, and you're only down from him from like 5 to 6 points, because really you need to compare waiver wire players to waiver wire players. You're not comparing him to A.J. Brown. You're not comparing him to basic starters. You're comparing him to back-end roster guys, waiver wire players who are not expected to go bonkers. So looking at it in that light, a hot waiver wire player versus a guy who's a top-end dude, who's a lottery ticket, if he busts on you, it's not going to kill you that much. But you also got to realize the risk involved that if you swing and miss, it's going to hurt you. But you're going to have to sometimes swing for the fence. And these are those types of players that you swing for the fence with. And it's your strategy with your lineup. What's going on with your team. It's not good player versus bad player. It's the strategy with the whole game involved. And you got to look at that as a whole when you're setting your lineups. And you're going to miss sometimes. If you're starting Shakur a lot, or wide receivers like this, you're going to miss a lot of times. But sometimes you got to do that. Sometimes you got to make that decision. But that's why I like Kahlil Shakur. Same thing with A.T. Perry, but a little bit different. Rasheed Shahid is out with an injury. He's a hope and prayer right now, but we're seeing an increase in snap share. We're seeing him be somewhat productive with 11.8 PPR fantasy points in Week 10. So let's see what happens with him. He could be a pickup in deeper leagues. Basic 12-man leagues, maybe if you're hurting. Maybe. It really depends on your situation and your strategy, but there's also some other wide receivers you can look at. Other wide receivers are also being dropped. That could be pickups as well. So A.T. Perry might be a guy to look at, might not. Jamison Williams, same thing as Kahlil Shakur. Upside wide receiver, fast, gritty downfield, gets those air yards, a lottery ticket. So when you put him in your lineup, which we need a player like this, especially for some time throughout the season, if not all the time, just on the back end of your roster as that upside flyer. But when you put that lottery ticket in your lineup, you're swinging for the fence with a high likelihood that you're going to strike out, but you need to swing for the fence. He's a prime example, a Will Fuller-esque player that you can do that with. If you need one of those, Jamison Williams. Jaylen Hyatt is primed for that. Jaylen Hyatt is built to be the air yards guy, is built to be the Will Fuller, but we're watching him, we're paying attention to him, a rookie wide receiver who at this time in the draft process, a lot of people were mocking him as a first-round wide receiver. A lot of people were saying he was one of the best deep threats in the class, and he is a good deep threat. 90.8 air yards per game in his last 4 games. That's air yard city. You want that from your wide receivers. That's starter level air yards. That's top tier starter air yards. If you're pushing around 100 yards a game in air yards, that's very solid. Just the targets aren't there. 3.5 per game. Quarterback plays really not there, but we're getting a little something here. Jaylen Hyatt, though. Jaylen Hyatt is a hope and prayer wide receiver. That's what he is. And also a rookie wide receiver who might develop some over time over this last leg of the season. You might want to have him as a stash. You might look at him as a stash play just in case he hits. Also for 2024, watch what he does. Remember the name. You may want to be drafting him with one of your last picks next year, wherever he's going in ADP, but he's got some upside. Odell Beckham, last 4 games, 5.3 targets a game, 19.4% target share. So we're pushing a 20% target share. A wide receiver getting that type of workload you want to look at. Last 4 games, 7 targets, 2 targets, 7 targets, 5 targets. So it's fairly consistent. 13.2 ADOT, so he's getting targets deep downfield. That fuels fantasy production. The Ravens pass catchers are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. But it's the waiver wire. You never know what you're going to get either way. Now we're looking at Greg Dortch, 17 targets in his last 2 games, 23% target share, and Kyler Murray is back, and Greg Dortch just has these runs from time to time. He had it last year. He just does it. He's a good wide receiver. He's very nuanced. He can create separation. He's a very good technical wide receiver who every NFL team would love to have him as a piece of their offense. And he is doing some things on the field, and he's a guy that you can throw in your lineup and close your eyes with. You can't trust him every week, but the targets will be there sometimes. They'll be there sometimes. We know this throughout history. The targets will be there sometimes. And he's starting to heat up. He's starting to do some things. 8 targets in week 11, 9 in week 12. You got to pay attention to Greg Dortch. I don't see many people talking about him, but he's a player that if you're hurting, you're in a deeper league, you're looking for a wide receiver, Greg Dortch might be a guy for you to look at. But there's also wide receivers to look at that have been dropped in your league that aren't normal waiver wire players that you may want to pick up ahead of some of these guys. Let me know who's been dropped in the comments below. I want to hear about that so I can hear about the market as well. Also, I want to thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on the way out. Ric Flair's watching you. You don't want to disappoint him. He really wants you to hit that button. But thank you again. I'll catch you on the next video.